creating that kind of synthesis within can really, for me, it feels like it sort of loosens up the hold of like reality as we know it and makes it easier to perceive things that lie beyond.
I've spent a lot of time kind of in meditation and working in shamanic states in different traditions, and there's this practice of really connecting to the elements. And in your book, you write about a particular practice that I've found to be really potent, which is taking the ice in one hand and the fire in the other. Maybe you could actually walk us through, like, tell the listeners a bit about this practice, and which is one that I've taken from your book and has really come alive in my kind of my daily practices. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. And sure. So there's a few different ways we do that because it's something that really runs through so much of what we do in ritual and practice. Like there's some meditations that tap into the same logic. And most directly, when preparing for something like ritual or doing specific sacred work, what we do is invoke fire and ice by calling the runes Isa and Kenaz of the Elder Futhark rune set, which represent the forces of ice, which some could say is like stasis or order, but I see it as more sort of a more gradual kind of change of a sort of a different kind of continuous process, but one that can also move very swiftly. And fire, which you could see as more rapid and dynamic, but also something that can be tempering and reinforcing. And by bringing these things together in like consecrating ritual space, we are reenacting that moment of creation. And by doing that, are opening the way for new things to happen and sort of giving charge to what it is that we do.
In my practices, this has been, I mean, it's just kind of wild, right? Like when we can get quiet enough and get still enough in our own being and really connect to our breath in a deep way, the level of sensitivity that then occurs in our own body mind becomes pretty significant. And so for me, just imagining in my right hand the feeling of ice, right? Just feeling the deep cold and feeling kind of almost the burn of the cold, right? And the stillness of the ice, and then in my left hand, feeling fire, feeling like a flame come from my palms, and really allowing those two sensations to kind of grow and expand, and then in a moment bring them together in a clap, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the feeling then that occurs in the kind of the center part of the body in the tantric traditions, we talk about it as the inner flute or the center column, right? I've had all sorts of wild stuff happen, right? Like visuals of like flowers blooming in my chest and heart, and greenery, just like the torso just turning green with creation, with these two elements bringing them together, and the feelings persist. I remember the first time I did this, like my hand was just cold like all day. It just had this tingle of kind of the deep cold. Like I'm driving the car and just feeling the cold of Niflheim, right? And feeling the cold just throughout the day and feeling connected to that. I think these are the ways that some of these practices become kind of a personal way of being, right? Like being connected to the elements and in this way. Yes.
Yeah. And that's something that I like to incorporate that in other ways as well. Like there's one meditation that is in the book that's used for helping to open yourself up to the other worlds of the 9 worlds on the world tree. And how it does it is by tapping into things that are similar to that we find in nature, particularly the core of the earth and the cold of the vacuum of space that lies beyond the atmosphere. And
Mm.
creating that kind of synthesis within can really, for me, it feels like it sort of loosens up the hold of like reality as we know it and makes it easier to perceive things that lie beyond.
Yeah, and so you write about in the book kind of the difference between the traditionalist view of this, right? Like there are some kind of sects of paganism that are really like in some ways like fundamentalists, right? Like they're quite literally trying to preserve the precise traditions as they were. And your point of view is more that we bring them alive and make them relevant for the moment we're in, right? And in doing so, you talk a bit about like there are the gods, but correct me if I'm wrong, but like there's the idea of like the gods and goddesses that also exist as forces. You talk about them as forces in the book, so they're like, we're not necessarily taking this like quite literal interpretation of these. They're meant to be these elemental forces that exist for us to be in relationship with, to find some deeper level of harmony and meaning and, kind of potency in our life. Is that right?
Somewhat. Like, I see them as sort of gods are just, I mean, if you just take it as writ of what's in the source material, these are beings that have a sufficiently comprehensive knowledge of matter and energy and all these other things to spin stars from the firmament and
Mhm.
uh create the building blocks of life and all these other things that are like them trying to explain how they do these things would probably, like, in a way that they could understand, would almost be like trying to explain algebra to ants. You know. um so it's like, I think they have a sense of agency to them, and they have a
Mm,
definite sense of personality. And but I also think that that's like, the stories are our way of understanding these powers that are definitely conscious and animate, but also represent so much more than just, this is literally a bearded old man with one
mhm.
eye who wanders the world with a spear in his hand. Though those are things that can help recognize and understand them, because I see it as sort
Yes.
of like the names, the forms, and all these things that these powers take on as part of how we comprehend them and how we're able to better, like, wrap our brains around these things that are, sort of like trying to shove the ocean into a water glass.
Yeah, so there's some meaning making that's helpful. I'm curious if there are like particular gods or goddesses that you call on in certain situations in your life. Do you have a particular resonance with a particular kind of god, or I'm just curious how you relate to this, specifically the gods and goddesses, like how you bring them to life for yourself.
For me, I see them as, like, particularly the one I work with the most is Odin. I have a particularly close relationship with Odin. That's one that has sort of grown and developed as my practice and understanding both of him and the broader um, thing that is heathenry and heathen practice has grown with time. Um, and I see, like, in some ways, I interact with him in ecstatic states and in meditation, of that sometimes he will come as, like, sort of more a um you could say clear and animate personality taking on, like, a form you're comfortable with, so to speak. The Sometimes it'll be more like a strong feeling or that sort of tingle in the back of your head. Or sometimes there will be moments of synchronicity, like encountering pairs of ravens unexpectedly before, like, having to do something particularly challenging. Or
The raven being Odin's eyes, right? Like in this
Mhm.
tradition, yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that, for me, Odin, as well as many of the other gods, will manifest. And also sometimes even in, like, transpossessory work, though, I mean, I'm personally not as skilled in that. There's other people I work with who are much better in that particular art. There's just so many ways that they come in and can interact with us that are, and there's different ways you can think of it as well, because also, like, to from a more intellectual perspective, I see, like, there's a lot of, like, metaphor and, like, valuable lessons that can be learned from the stories themselves, both in Odin's virtues as well as his fairly significant flaws.
Indeed. Yeah.
Right. Our gods are flawed, and we have no problem with accepting that and occasionally having a laugh about it.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Yeah.